legend of the vampire is an old one, with claims dating back to the earliest human civilizations of blood-drinking undead that prowled the land as the sun began to set. But what exactly is this macabre creature, and why was it so feared? Vampires are undead monsters that feed on blood for sustenance. Blood represents life in many ancient cultures, and to drink the blood of another would be the equivalent of draining their life force and vitality, transferring it to the vampire. The first mention of vampires would arise in the ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia and Sumeria. Despite the many tales of blood-drinking entities, most of them demons, one tale in particular would stand out in later discussions. In Sumer, there existed a legend of a beautiful maiden who would attempt to entrance mortal men she was fond of. This being would go on to be called Lilitu, not to be confused with the race of demons of the same name. Lilitu would become the archetypical vampire progenitor, and was believed to be a powerful creature that governed and represented the night. Her origins are never clarified, with some suspecting her to have once been a harlot before becoming a cannibalistic monster. The Hebrew legends that came after would make reference to lesser Liliths, beings that possessed the traits of Lilith, the first wife of Adam. Lilith would wrongly be attributed with the creation of vampires in the modern age, when it would be more likely that, similar to the four brides of Samael, Lilitu was counted amongst these lesser Liliths, and the true origin of the vampire race. Lilitu and Lilith would also be used as interchangeable names, further compounding on the confusion regarding both these entities. Whatever the case, the curse of vampirism would go on to spread to the farthest reaches of the globe and birth the bloodthirsty race known as vampires. Tales of blood-drinking undead would soon spread around the globe, with locals fearing to walk the streets in the absence of the sun, as the fear would build up, eventually exploding into full-blown hysteria in Europe. The church and the state would make many attempts to quell the panic to no avail, with even some priests giving in to the primal fear of the Night Stalkers, leading bands of common folk to check and double-check the graves of the dead. In many regions of the world, holy relics would be hung in homes in hopes of warding off the monsters, ready to set their eyes on those within. In modern occultism and legend, the idea of a vampire goddess would further be discussed, with reference to her Sumer and Hebrew origins, associated with the Qliphoth, now as well as Lilith. She would gain godlike status, similar to that held in the lands of Mesopotamia and Sumer, and many secret names and forms, including spiders, snakes, and more. She would typically be described as an aspect of Lilith, similar to the descriptions of the lesser Liliths of Jewish and Kabbalistic sects of the Old World. As there are many breeds of vampire, there are thus many variations in the forms they possess, with some looking more humanoid than others. Whilst there is no truly definitive description, there are basic traits that many vampires share, their skin ranging from paper white to grey to even black, becoming hardened and making them incredibly tough and durable, with stories of vampires surviving sword blows and such being commonplace. Some vampires, especially those in Europe, could become bloated after gorging themselves on blood, with the blood of their victims oozing from every orifice. The more powerful races of vampires could hide their unnatural traits, such as claws and fangs, easily disguised amongst their human prey. It should be noted that many folklorists will label any blood-drinking entity a vampire, an understandable but erroneous method of classification. Ghouls are often confused with vampires as they share many traits, including sensitivity to light, macabre appearances and behavior, and shapeshifting abilities. However, ghouls are typically more adept shapeshifters, and unlike vampires, they are alive. Indeed, living vampires such as aswangs are more accurately classed as ghouls, feeding on not only blood, but also viscera, corpses, and amniotic fluid. Several instances of such classifications are commonplace, the most notorious of which is the Jewish Lilith, a female archdemon that has been immortalized in modern legend as a vampire and taken the spotlight from Lilitu. The causes of their creation are many and varied in folklore, ranging from people whose corpses were desecrated to people born in a strange or unique manner, such as the seventh son or daughter of a seventh son or daughter. Additionally, corpses jumped over by animals were also said to be prone to rising as vampires. In a final attempt to quell the public, the church would brand accused dead vampires as former witches, which would only serve to fan the flames of the chaos. However, all the various causes shown above and more confirm one thing: there is no true cause for the affliction, and it can come to anyone no matter the sort of life they had lived, a harder and more terrifying truth to accept. There are, however, believed to be root causes of the curse. The first of these is the most well known, that being the bite of another vampire creating a new member of its kind via infection. Despite the belief that consuming the dirt of the grave of the assailant would cure the victim, Arnold Peel, forgive me if I butchered the name, a well-known vampire, would attempt this before his death and unfortunately fail, as claims that he had returned from the grave would begin to circulate. The second method was more intentional, involving the use of magic to turn oneself into an undead being. Whilst this idea is popularly attributed to the church, similar beliefs existed in other regions and were likely exaggerated as a universal cause by some church leaders. Regardless, the use of the dark arts could create vampires, whether this involved raising oneself from the grave or raising the corpses of the deceased to serve the black magician as vampiric slaves. The third method was more random. Those turned from the gates of the afterlife, for whatever reason, would return as vampires to haunt the living, similar to ghosts. Whilst evil people were more likely to be turned away, unfortunate individuals who had lived relatively mundane lives could also return, down to an existence of drinking the blood of the living in order to survive. The last variant could be born from the corpses of humans that possessed unnatural abilities or potential, such as potential mages or people born with two souls. In Romania, the Physicality was formerly a human who was born with a tail that allowed him or her to transform into an animal, typically a wolf. The behavior of vampires greatly varied. Sudden deaths of multiple people and cattle was attributed to the presence and feeding of a vampire. Most notably, however, vampires had the compulsive desire to count their surroundings, a mental disorder known as arithmomania. It is unknown why this is the case. On the less dangerous scale, some would only make their presence known by engaging in minor poltergeist activity, but the worst vampires would go out of their way to harm the living, with vampires such as the Nelapsi torturing prey for weeks before ending their lives and feeding. The morality of vampires is ambiguous to say the least. Their need for the blood of the living has tarnished their reputation over the millennia and seen them branded as unholy creatures in service to dark powers. The reality is more complex. As previously stated, those that possessed evil tendencies in life are more likely to return as revenants. However, like ghosts, this was not always the case. Indeed, many ambivalent, or even more rarely, benevolent people could return from the grave, blinded by hysteria, panic, and worst of all, a gnawing hunger for blood. Vampires that counted themselves among such unfortunate individuals included the Prikoliki, who was formerly a human and lucky enough to be born with a tail that allowed them to change form from man to beast, and the Upire, which was a vampire that could return from the grave and, surprisingly, continue with its previous normal life, using its gifts of manipulation and disguise. Such individuals would feed on blood not because they were particularly evil, but because they required it to live, though the more twisted members of the species would engage in much darker activities. Some Upires would be reported bathing in buckets of blood, madly glutting themselves far more than necessary. Such stories paint vampires as more than just destructive, bloodthirsty beings. Like living humans, they can choose a better path, but lesser members of the race are usually not sentient enough to make such decisions or suppress their desire to feed, bound and enslaved to evil masters, or simply already evil monsters in life to begin with. Vampires wield a myriad of abilities, with some breeds having powers unique to them specifically, such as shapeshifting for the Vukodlaki and psionics for Upires. That said, many powers are widely attributed to the entire race. The ability to produce natural weapons such as claws and fangs is a notable example, representing the primal beast within that the vampire becomes once they rise from the grave. The more powerful vampires hide these traits in order to move amongst normal human civilization undetected. Vampires are also noted for possessing supernatural strength, speed, and durability. They could easily tear humans and cattle apart, and there are tales of them either surviving blows that would kill a lesser man, or simply phasing through weapons like phantoms. The use of familiars is also common amongst even the weaker members of the race, allowing them great understanding of their hunting grounds. This ability extended even further, allowing them to take on the traits of these animals or control large groups of them at once. The more powerful and intelligent vampires could disguise their inhuman features, allowing them to throw off hunters with glamours for limited periods of time and settle in main cities. Vampires are also well versed in various esoteric arts, including magic and mysticism, with users of the latter usually drawing upon the power of powerful demons to boost their abilities. As a race, they appear to have a high magic aptitude, with even some lesser vampires mastering basic but dangerous spells. Vampires possess as many weaknesses as they do strengths, and in the tales of the old world, various defenses and preventative measures exist to prevent the return of the deceased. The most common defense was the cross, and this held true in other cultures as well, where holy relics and or chants could ward off demons and revenants alike. Other types of apotropaics also included plants such as hawthorn and garlic, as well as holy or flowing water and consecrated ground. In medieval Europe, the vampire hunters were the best measures against creatures of darkness, intuitively knowing all the weaknesses and even simply possessing the natural ability to kill them when no one else could. In the worst case scenario, in which the hunters were unavailable, the people would brace themselves and take matters into their own hands, nailing the corpse to the coffin before driving a stake of hawthorn into the chest, or simply choosing to decapitate the body and burn the remains, putting the deceased to rest. These methods were all used when the vampire dwelt in the coffin, as it was believed that this was when they were weakest. Another iconic weakness is their sensitivity to sunlight. The range of this discomfort varied depending on the breed, with the higher vampires being wholly unaffected by its influence. The umpire could notably operate both in the day and the night with no ill effects. A related vulnerability, fire was an effective method that could, for the most part, destroy the vampire in one blow. Another weakness that was employed amongst mages was the use of magic seals to capture these creatures as slaves. This practice existed in Europe, Asia, and even a few Hebrew tales, and it was rare for mages who sought out vampires to do so with the sole desire of exorcising them. Those that did would seal the vampire in a bottle and toss it into a fire, killing the creature, a belief originating from Bulgaria. The weaknesses presented by our ancestors are legion, and those listed are the most common that were recognized worldwide.